Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another session of the Summer of Peace, a free global online summit designed to help you transform conflict in your heart, your relationships, and the world. Summer of Peace is a production of the Shift Network. I'm Philip Helmick, the Director of Peace at the Shift Network. And we're so glad that you're here with us for another session, especially today. We're looking at embodying peace from the inner to the international. We encourage you to engage us online at facebook.com/Shift Network. That's facebook.com/Shift Network. And today, so this is the fifth session today, and we're going to round out by looking at exploring peace building session called 3.0, Sustainable Peace in a Complex Networked World. And we're just really thrilled to have with us is Melanie Greenberg, who's the President and CEO of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. The Alliance for Peacebuilding is just a fabulous, fabulous association of over 70 peace and conflict resolution organizations around the world. And it's considered in the Washington, D.C. area and around the world as one of the premier associations and thought leaders of really looking what the trends are emerging around the world. Now, for Melanie, before joining the Alliance for Peacebuilding, she was the president and founder of the Cypress Fund for Peace and Security, a foundation making grants in the areas of peacebuilding and nuclear non-proliferation. From 2003 to 2004, she was a visiting scholar at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, focusing on issues of justice and post-conflict peacebuilding. From 2000 to 2002, Melanie was director of the Conflict Resolution Program at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. She previously served as Associate Director of the Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation and Deputy Director of the Stanford Center on International Conflict and Negotiation. In her work on international conflict resolution, Melanie has helped design and facilitate public peace processes in the Middle East, Northern Ireland, and the Caucasus. She has taught advanced courses in international conflict resolution, multi-party conflict resolution, and negotiation at Stanford Law School and Georgetown University Law School, and is currently an adjunct faculty member at the Elliott School of George Washington University. She was lead editor and chapter author of the volume Words Over War, Mediation and Arbitration to Prevent Deadly Conflict. And Melanie holds an AB from Harvard and a JD from Stanford Law School. And she's also the proud mother of a daughter who is now at Oberlin. And Oberlin is a school that we've learned through over the years. It has quite a few people from the peace and conflict resolution. And the Alliance for Peacebuilding website is allianceforpeacebuilding.org. Melanie, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, Philip, thank you for that really lovely introduction. And I'm such a tremendous admirer of the Shift Network and all that you're doing. I'm just so thrilled and honored to be here.
Yeah, and well, thank you. And you know, the Shift Network, we're really grateful to be members of the Alliance for Peacebuilding and also the partnerships over the year. And I know Chip House is on your board, who organized a week of peace in the military a couple of years ago. We really just have really profound respect for what you're doing. And this is a perfect session here, Melanie, because we started the day with a young spiritual teacher from India looking at the inner world. We had Gay and Katie Hendricks looking at relationships, and Dr. Shafali with parenting, and Sheila Elworthy looking at the inner dimension of international peacebuilding. So we would like to hear from you is what are some of the trends that you're seeing in the broader peace and conflict resolution world? What do you see developing? What are some positive signs, some challenges, and so forth?
Well, thank you for that question. And I see one of the most interesting trends in peace building actually being peace building and how it relates to other fields. So peace building, when it first started, was very much a series of processes: conflict resolution, negotiation, mediation. And over the last 20 years or so, peace building has started to show up as integrating with fields like development, health, education, democracy. And so some of the interesting work that I'm seeing here in Washington and in the work I do around the world is how do you build peace building into things like elections, into water programs, into transitional justice, after conflict, how to make sure that perpetrators are held accountable. And I think that's really some of the most interesting work that's going on right now, and that we're seeing both here in Washington, but also at the United Nations and around the world.
Okay. And Melanie, when you use the word peace building, what does that mean for you and colleagues?
Well, there are as many definitions of peace building as there are people in the room or people involved with conflict. But the way I see it is that peace is obviously something that we can build. It's not simply the absence of violence, but it's how do you create societies where conflict can be resolved through peaceful means, through dialogue, through politics, through talking, rather than through deadly violence. And so peace building is, as I mentioned before, consensus building conversation, but it's also development. How do you make sure that when you're building bridges in schools and hospitals, you're doing it in a way that will not add to the conflict, but in fact ameliorates conflict? When you're thinking about an educational system, how do you make sure that your textbooks are not leaning in favor of one narrative of conflict in society rather than the other? So it's really a broad enterprise that's setting up a society to be resilient for conflict, and that doesn't keep evolving into spirals of deadly violence.
Excellent, excellent. I know when I was at Search for Common Ground, which I know is a member of the Alliance, we always talked about conflict being a natural part of life, and it's actually a potential engine for growth and transformation. Is that pretty much standard thinking nowadays, that conflict is just a natural part of life and societies, and it's more of how we manage it?
Absolutely. Because if you think about your own family, that there are always going to be issues you don't agree on. But if you have a conflict with your neighbor, you don't go out and shoot him, you talk about it. And it's really the same internationally, that conflict can be a very creative force, because through conflict you get to see different perspectives, you learn about the different needs people have, generational differences. And it's really how you manage the conflict that's important, and that if you try to tamp it down and ignore it, it tends to pop up in places that can be very harmful.
Okay, excellent. And you mentioned that the past few decades that there's been an increased look at the different ways of peace building and entering into different sectors or fields. I know when I was at Search for Common Ground, there was a lot of discussion about conflict is in every sector of society. It's not just a separate thing. You have peace building and then you move on and then you look at the environment, or then you look at agriculture or something. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what you're seeing, again, with the trends in the United Nations, in Washington, D.C., and so forth, about the front edge of really integrating peace building throughout these sectors?
Well, a really fascinating process is going on right now at the United Nations that will have effects for all of us for the next 15 years. And as some of you might know, the Millennium Development Goals, which have been governing United Nations development work for the last 15 years, are about to expire. And so all the countries of the world are coming together to design the architecture for the next 15 years. And for the first time, peace is on the agenda. The Millennium Development Goals had a small mention of peace in the preamble, but no metrics, no place for peace in the rest of the goals that governed maternal health, education, development, environment. Moving forward, there's been international advocacy for making sure that peace is an integral part of development. And there's a recognition that in areas that are swept constantly by conflict, development just gets washed away. So if you look at somewhere like South Sudan or the Central African Republic or even Afghanistan, a number of those countries haven't reached even a single Millennium Development Goal because of the waves of violence and conflict. So the Secretary General of the United Nations issued a high-level panel report which put peace not only as one of the main pillars of the new goals, but as a target for all the other goals leading throughout the plan. So whether you're working on health, education, sustainable development, there will be a peace element. It's being somewhat fiercely contested by a number of countries because the idea is really linked often to good governance. Or some people say that this is something that the Security Council should deal with rather than the rest of the United Nations. But I think it's a very, very important trend that conflict is now being seen and peace building is being seen as just integral to all these other fields.
Interesting. Very interesting. Let's elaborate on this a little bit about how it's being seen as a need, and at the same time where the resistance can be, and also just languaging, because I know when we were together in Washington, D.C. last year, we talked about a need for rebranding peace, and it sounds like peace building is emerging more as terminology that's more acceptable. Could you just elaborate a little bit here?
Well, peace building is very definitely gaining traction because it's an umbrella term that covers so many other concepts: conflict resolution, conflict prevention, conflict mitigation, peacekeeping. There are pockets of organizations around the world for which this definition is much more specific. For example, the United Nations, peace building is what happens after a conflict has been resolved. It's kind of that post-conflict stage. But in general, peace building has taken on much more legitimacy as a concept around the world.
Okay. And how about where there's just a little bit of resistance to it? Talk more a little bit about good governance or anything else that you've run across. I'm just curious.
So I'll give you two areas where we're finding it. So the first is within this United Nations, where 153 countries are now coming together to negotiate the terms of the new Millennium Development Goals. And we're hearing a couple of different lines of resistance. The first is that peace shouldn't be part of development because that tends to securitize development. The development should be all about economic growth, about the environment, but that any issues regarding peace should be under the auspices of the Security Council. So it's a very UN-centric kind of argument.
Okay.
There are others who say, well, so much of the way this is being framed right now, this debate, is around legitimate governance and rule of law. But there are a number of countries that feel very threatened by this, dictatorships or others that just feel China, for example, really does not want to be linked with any resolutions that would require, this is universal, all countries be required to accept this, does not necessarily want to be governed by these issues of kind of democratic, legitimate governance.
Interesting. Okay.
There are other countries, especially a number of Latin American countries, that don't want to have to worry about the number of homicides in their country, that they're somehow being put on a bad list because they're being tracked by the number of homicides in their countries. So for Guatemala, for Honduras, for countries that are suffering really severe waves of criminal violence right now, not just political violence, there's some resistance to having a peace goal. And then there's just politics as usual within the UN, where there's a zero-sum mentality, a sense that, well, if you have a peace goal, that's going to take money away from sustainable development or other goals. So it's a little bit more of horse trading.
Interesting. Okay, I know the U.S. Agency for International Development chose not to have a department on peace building, but rather they had conflict mitigation, which then supports peace building through the other sectors. Isn't that the way it's functioning at this point?
So yes, within USAID, we actually work very closely with the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, and they serve as a bureau that anyone within AID can contact, and they have very close relations with all the other bureaus that put a conflict lens onto all the other development work. They also are supporting the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, which is a very radical experiment in blending peace building and development in the kinds of places we've just been discussing.
Okay. And do you see a similar type of thinking emerging then in the UN about having a similar type of functionality then that goes across, so there's not the sense of competition from, taken away from development money and so forth?
Well, the UN bureaucracy is so complicated, but they are also, in 2015, are starting a review of what they call their peace-building architecture. So it's not all the agencies at the UN that deal with peace in some form or the other, but it's at their peace-building support office and their peace-building commission and their peace-building fund, which tend to work in fragile states with very difficult conflict histories. So they will be reviewing that. There is not as much of an initiative to look across, the UN Development Program, UN peacekeeping operations, and how to move all those pieces in better harmony. And I think they actually would do very well to be thinking more along those lines.
Okay. And what are you and the Alliance members advocating for?
Well, we've been working very hard with the United Nations to advocate for a freestanding peace goal. While we think it's very important to mainstream peace throughout all the other goals, we've been fighting very hard to make sure that peace remains its own pillar, and also for developing the kinds of measurements that it's very hard to measure peace. And the field in many ways has been held back because we can't measure with the same degree of precision our progress the way that public health officials or education officials can. So we've been advocating both within the United Nations for this pillar, but also working with our own government to make sure that the U.S. position in the negotiations is strongly in favor of a peace goal and very strong peace mainstreaming.
Okay. It's interesting, Melanie, because I remember when I started at Search for Common Ground in '97, we were trying to figure out how to measure the impact of media for transforming conflict. And people at the time saying you can't prove a negative, and yet at the same time, I know the research and evaluation methodologies have really grown in the past 17 years. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've seen some real progress in terms of being able to measure peace building?
That's a great question. And I used to be at the Hewlett Foundation, and one of the ongoing concerns there was that we just couldn't measure peace with the same precision that we could the other programs in the foundation. Since then, we've made tremendous progress using different kinds of methodologies, ranging from randomized control trials, which is what you would use like in a medical trial, where you have a control group and a group that you're measuring, and seeing some really interesting impacts there. For example, Mercy Corps, a very large development organization with the Peacebuilding program, did a randomized control trial of its drought relief programs. And some of them contained peace-building elements where there would be dialogue, for example, about water usage and well placement. And then drought relief programs where there was none of that, no dialogue. And they found that the drought relief programs were markedly more effective when they had the peace-building elements built in than when they didn't. So that's really the gold standard, although I think very little peace building is, you're able to have a real control group. And so there are all kinds of methodologies that look at, how do you measure the impact of your program in a larger, very noisy conflict environment? How do you measure satisfaction? But even more than that, how do you construct good theories of change so that you really understand from the very beginning your theory of how your program will work, and then how you go back and keep measuring it and having feedback all throughout the program, rather than just at the end after 5 years you go back and measure retroactively.
Right. And this raises a wonderful question we were talking about earlier about complexity. And because I know when I was working at Search for Common Ground, you could have a project and you can go and evaluate that project, and yet that project is in a larger dynamic field. And how do you measure the larger system and the shifts, and also how to make sure the project that you're doing doesn't have inadverse effects, even though it could show positive results in the evaluation. Talk with us, because I know there's so much thinking going on around complexity. Tell us a little bit about that, and this could lead into the conference that you just recently had.
So this is what I think is really one of the cutting-edge areas of the field. Because there's a recognition that if you look at the kinds of conflicts we're facing around the world, Syria, South Sudan, Central African Republic, Afghanistan, or even the waves of crime and criminal violence that are sweeping across Western Africa, Central America, that these are what we call wicked problems, that they are problems that are so complex with so many factors that linear solutions don't work. And in fact, as you mentioned, Philip, they could have unintended consequences that make things worse. And so how do you begin to map and address wicked problems? And this is an area where systems engineering has been working for decades. And more recently, in the last 5 or 6 years, a number of peace-building experts like Robert Zigliano at University of Wisconsin, who's also our board chair, a number of scholars in Columbia, and just around the country and around the world, are saying, how can we use systems approaches to peace-building? And a systems approach looks not just at one intervention, but maps a whole system and what they call feedback loops. So if you were to look at a country like Nigeria, you might look at lots of the different sectors that are operating to create the kind of environment there is in the ground. You look at their banking system, their energy systems, groups like Boko Haram, just all the different ways, all the different inputs into conflict in that society. And you start to say, well, what kinds of programs do we know have made a good difference? What kind of programs have had a negative impact? And you can start to build a systems map. And once you've built that map, you start to see areas where you could have particular leverage into a system. And it might be that the leverage is not a standard peace-building system, but might operate around rule of law, anti-corruption, children's or girls' education, some kind of religious program. But it's only when you start looking at that system and what they call listening to the system do you begin to get a sense of how you can build nonlinear solutions. So it's a field that's still very much in its infancy, but in the places where it's been applied, it's really had a very profound shift in how people understand the systems in which they're operating.
Can you give us an example?
Well, the military's actually been on the forefront of using systems thinking. And the idea that once you come into an area, your very presence alone changes it. And so beginning to understand, well, what does it mean to introduce force? And what are the second level effects that might be drawn from that? And how can you start to address those second level effects? So they've been doing some really interesting work. Let me think of some other where that's actually changed the programming. USAID is very interested in this, and is trying to think about some of its missions on the ground and how to start to link their different programs so that they're operating more holistically. Okay. And part of the goal of these systems analysis is that every sector is aware of every other sector, and you can start to think about interoperability. Because so often you'll be in the middle of a conflict zone and have no idea, who else is working in the area, what they're working on, who's more effective, how you could join together your programs.
Right. It's interesting, Melanie, because we've been seeing just in other areas of peacebuilding where there's more and more interest in synergy and collaboration instead of people just doing their own thing and, just doing their own things and then say, hey, we did this, but rather what can we accomplish more? And in some ways, I would imagine for someone listening, it could come as a surprise that you could be in a conflict zone and not have agencies actually knowing what each other are doing.
Well, and not only that, often these are just international agencies. Often they don't know what the indigenous peace-building capacity is like. There are often hundreds of local peace-building organizations that are working that nobody bothers to consult.
Right. It's interesting because I've heard Susan Collin Marks at Search for Common Ground just say, we're learning slowly, step by step, but there's progress. And I guess in some sense there needs to be an acknowledgement that in the past few decades there's been an exponential growth and at the same time a sense of patience with it too, huh?
Yes, very much so. And I think that we're learning slowly and steadily, but I think that also the technological revolution might speed up our learning because now there's so many different platforms in which you can come together and communicate in ways, and even the software to do the systems mapping has emerged. So I think we're in the cusp, I hope, of some faster learning. Okay,
excellent. You also mentioned to me prior to the call about storytelling being an important part of peace building. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yes. So we started to realize, and I'm sure you're really familiar with this through your work at Search, that it's very difficult to tell the story of peace building. that often the efforts are very quiet. They take place over a long period of time. While there are certainly moments of drama, a lot of it is this long-term relationship building work. And we were realizing as we started to talk with governments and militaries and trying to explain what we do, there are not a lot of good stories out there explaining that. At the same time, so that's kind of telling the story of peace building. But then we also realized that so much of peace building is about telling stories. That's how people talk about their lives, their visions for the future, their own narrative of the conflict. We also are not capturing that very well. And that our popular media, film, games, television, also doesn't do a very good job of capturing the nuances of peace building. And also, getting back to our systems discussion, one of the ways that you conduct a systems map is by collecting stories. So we realized that we need to do a much better job as a field in storytelling. So one of actually the best moments at our conference was one of our newest members is the International Storytelling Center in Jonesboro, Tennessee. And their president got up and did a poetry slam wearing his kilt. To give us a sense of how you could tell peace-building stories differently. And that might not obviously work in all environments, but it was a very, very good change of pace.
Interesting. And do you see this aspect of storytelling helping to mainstream peace-building more, or do you see where do you see storytelling and peace-building in more mainstream? Where do you see us today?
Well, I really see this as facing in a couple of different directions. Certainly building a better mainstream understanding in the U.S. of what peace building looks like. We've been talking with game creators of creating video games. We have an ongoing film and peace building roundtable to reach out to the Hollywood community and the media community here in Washington and New York to talk about how could we just tell better stories of peace. There's so many war games. Could there be peace games? And they're really creative, interesting people thinking about this, trying to bring peace back into our DNA, and also to counter the idea that peace is somehow either, it's your 60s VW bus Birkenstocks, or it's something that's so light and fluffy and amorphous it can't hold a candle to the serious, fear-based counterterrorism narratives that are coming out of Washington.
Right. Okay.
So that's one element.
Okay.
But the second element is also working with our own government, that there's a real hunger for new tools and new lenses, but a resistance to peace and peace building. And so how do we construct different narratives to convince our own government, and who are the right interlocutors to be talking about it?
Okay. Well, I'm just thinking about people listening right now and who'll be listening to the recording. How can they get involved with your efforts and support your efforts and learn more about it?
I first encourage everyone to come to our website, allianceforpeacebuilding.org. They can all become members. It's very easy to do. But there's so much you can do depending on kind of where your interest is in the world. You can start at home, that there is peace building happening in every community around the United States, that peace building is not only something that happens in countries far away from us, there's a real need for it here at home. So whether you're involved with a mediation clinic, with a church program, with a school group that's working on peace, there are many, many ways to be involved just in your own community. If you're interested in a more international outlook, you can go to the websites of any of our members, and many of them have ways you can join campaigns, add your name, just to be a part of this international community that's working for peace.
Interesting. Great. As we mentioned, the Summer of Peace has been really looking at mapping from inter to international ways for people to get involved. And again, Chip House with the Alliance was so wonderful in pulling together speakers around peace in the military a couple of years ago. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of, like, in your conference and elsewhere, about people in the international community looking at either the science or the spiritual aspect of inner peace and interpersonal peace. So
it's a very interesting question. often, especially here in Washington, there is sometimes some resistance to to talking at that level. But if you scratch the surface, you start to have very personal conversations about, military officers, their experience in a war zone, working with children, and a sense of how do they kind of keep their own heart and sense of balance when surrounded by these very, very difficult, traumatic kinds of situations. So especially when people start to talk about children and the next generation, it tends to open up.
Okay.
But I've seen a very, very large number of people in the peace-building community here who have mindfulness practices, meditation. I meditate, do yoga. There's many, many yoga practitioners. People with strong spiritual practices through their churches, their mosques, their synagogues. So that's often not the way people will lead in a conversation, but as you get to know each other and scratch the surface a little bit, it comes out. And maybe that's a little bit different from what I noticed living in California, where that was much more on the surface.
Yes, it is. And having made the move from being in Washington, D.C. for 20 years and then out to California, Melanie, it's been quite a fun switch. Susan Calamars and I joke about bridging East Coast, West Coast, and she says, you're more of a West Coast person, but you can bridge East Coast. So that's interesting. And what about some of the scientific research? Because we've had interviews with people, James Doty from Stanford at the Center for Altruism and Compassion Research. We've had a number of different scientists who are looking more at just how the brain functions, what happens when a person's in fear, what happens when you're able to alleviate that fear, what's the range of possibilities that open up. And in those interviews, Melanie, I've had such a strong sense that there's a lot of insights and lessons that help me understand, like what was happening in Burundi, for instance, Search for Common Ground's work there, of moving from a lot of fear to a place where there's an expanding of seeing the other and having a sense of compassion. Have you seen much of the integration of that scientific research into the peace-building arena?
I don't know if the integration is happening quite yet, but there's some fascinating, especially neuroscience, but as you alluded to, going on. And for example, Celia and Shamal Idris, who runs that, as you know, is about to take over the helm at Search for Common Ground. They have been doing neuroscience research on or with the students who take part in their cross-cultural online dialogues to actually look for the brain changes of what happens when people have been exposed to a intercultural curriculum. And there are profound changes. Similarly, the program on justice under transition, which is now known as Beyond Conflict, also works with the MIT Sachs Lab to look at questions of justice and the brain. But there's also been fascinating research that when people are in a position of fear, they're willing to suspend their usual moral judgments. So, for example, that they'll support torture if it somehow keeps them safe. And I think that gives, as you mentioned, Burundi, that gives a lot of insight into what it means for people who are living in fear and why they're willing to take part in violence or tolerate a level of violence they might not otherwise. Right.
Interesting.
And go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just saying. Please, Melanie, you're our guest. You go first.
Well, there's also interesting research about how violence, and especially with young men together, sets off certain pleasure areas of the brain that peace does not. So how do we counter those effects and find other kinds of reward centers that peace does activate?
Interesting. I had not heard that. That is very interesting. Huh. That would explain a lot. Is that more men than women, or where that's
yes,
found?
And it's much more men than women.
Interesting. That is very, very interesting. Huh. But what I was going to mention is when we interviewed Gay and Katie Hendricks earlier, they were talking about in relationships that they do quite a bit of work of helping people when they're triggered in a place of fear of how to physiologically and mentally move beyond that fear so they can engage in more peaceful, dialogue and relationships. And Bill Urey, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Bill Urey.
Yeah, I know, and I mentioned during that interview that Bill Urey, in one of our interviews, had talked about how, he was triggered once working with the president of Venezuela, and he realized that he needed to step back into the place of the witness, the balcony, to observe his reactions and not react, because he said, when angry, you will give the best speech you will ever regret. And so it's interesting to think that there's this research around fear, what happens to the brain, and then also all of these different practices coming up from these different sectors, Bill Urey and relationships and so forth, how to move beyond that fear.
I think some of the most interesting work going on in the field right now is on trauma healing and how to help whole societies that have been governed by fear move beyond that, because just as you said, if you're still in that state of fear and state of anger, it's much harder to go about the kinds of peace building and reconciliation activities and even development activities you need to move beyond conflict. And I think that trauma piece, both individually but also kind of culturally, has come to the fore recently.
Interesting. Okay. Let me just say to our listeners, if anyone has a question, please go ahead and type it in on the webcast or hit 1 on your touch-tone phone. But I know we're getting close to the time here. Melanie, Washington, D.C. can be an intense environment. How do you maintain your peace? I mean, I know you're a mother and your daughter's now up in college, and you make a commute in and out of work. How do you maintain your center?
Oh, thank you. It's a very good question. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I do have a yoga and a mindfulness practice, and so I think that really helps just let me take a deep breath and stay centered during, what can be just it's a physically and emotionally demanding place. There's a lot of conflict. Just if you look at Congress and the way people engage here, it's very intense. I try to guard my family life very preciously. I actually have a son at home as well. He's 17, so about to leave the nest, but still at home. And trying to make sure I don't take my work home with me and to really carve out some space. I try to be out in nature and to walk and be out in some green space every day, take my dog and just, try to be outside and think bigger thoughts. But I find that the work itself is it sets up a cycle of optimism. I mean, you have to be an optimist, I think, to be in this field and to try to see the best in people. And I think that goes a long way to countering the cynicism that you can sometimes find in Washington.
Interesting. Could you say a little more about this? Because I know when I was working at Search, having lived in Sierra Leone for 4 years and see it go through a war and going back during the war and seeing the slow peace-building process, I mean, there's a certain amount of resilience that's needed. And I think it was even Senator McCain who talked about how he survived being a prisoner of war. And he talked about the need to be a realist and at the same time a long-term optimist. Tell me more about your experience there.
I mean, in the optimism space?
Yeah, of that long-term optimism, because you're working for a long-term shifts here. You're not going to see major shifts, on a day-to-day basis. So how do you maintain your optimism?
Well, I think partially it's inborn that I've always tend to be a glass half full kind of person. But also as a lawyer and kind of a realist, knowing that that's not going to happen overnight, realizing that not everyone feels that way, recognizing that there are going to be spoilers and people who act for very different kinds of motives. But I found that generally peace builders seem to have that gene. There's a sense no matter how terrible things get, how much blood there is on people's hands, that there are people who are going to look for the future, want something better for their children, who have an innate sense that everyone might have the capacity for good and evil, but that you can prevail on the good. And I think it does border on spiritual, even though not everybody would identify it that way. But it's certainly something I've in just about everyone that I've met in this field.
Okay. We have a question here from Sue in Colorado. She wants to know, tell us your perceptions of the relationship between Democrats and Republicans in Washington, D.C.
Oi, as my grandmother would say. I have never seen Washington so polarized. There used to be a sense that you could govern from the middle, that there were moderate views, and now the groups are so far apart. It's interesting. For a long time, up till about 2 years ago, I did trainings a few times a year for congressional staff with Republicans and Democrats working together. And when I first started doing the training, I did a very much the kind of Harvard negotiation project kind of negotiation. You look for interest, you try to find your common ground. It was very cut and dry. But I started to realize that that wasn't working in this very polarized environment. And what they really needed was the kind of training that I give to groups in places like Northern Ireland or like Sierra Leone that are so deeply divided, and that the kinds of skills that you have to bring to deeply divided societies of trust building, consensus building, small bridge building was really where we need to be in Washington right now, because it is so polarized, so ineffective, nothing can get done. It's really very, very discouraging from a peace-building perspective, and just frankly from being a citizen here. And it has ramifications that when the government shut down last October, I was at a meeting with an ambassador from a West African country, and he said, Melanie, a little tongue-in-cheek, talk some sense to your government. He said, because when we, sitting here in West Africa, look at either the American democratic model or a Chinese model that's more centrally planned authoritarian, the American model isn't looking so good.
Very interesting. Wow, okay. I
should also, I just mentioned, since we're talking about the inner to the international, I have a bipartisan family that my son and my husband are Republican, and my daughter and I are quite liberal Democrats. And so a lot of our conversation is around how can you respect other people's principles? How can you find common ground? How do you talk about politics? And I kind of wish that the Congress would have the same kind of conversations that we're having around our dinner table.
Well, that's fun. Well, we're kind of close to our close here. What would you want listeners to hear? Right where you just left off about dinner table conversations. What would you like our listeners to really take to heart?
I would love for all of them to be able sometimes to step back from their own experiences and experience someone else's worldview. Somebody that you don't know very well, someone who's in a different side of whatever spectrum you happen to be on. I think that we're not teaching those skills very well to our children, of how to hold your own opinion in abeyance and really try to listen actively to someone else's point of view. And not necessarily to agree with it, but to try to understand it. And I think that just that little skill is about 85% of peace building. And if there's some way that people could start to be having those conversations over their dinner tables, with their schools, over their neighbors' fences, that would be a really, really positive thing.
Beautiful, beautiful, Melanie. That's something we all can do. Excellent. Well, Melanie, any final words here besides listening about Alliance or anything else you'd like our listeners to know about?
Well, I really just want to thank you, Philip, and the whole SHIFT network, and to all of your audience for caring about peace and making such a commitment to it at all the different levels at which you operate. I'm just so honored to be a part of it, and really would encourage anyone who wants to follow up with me or the Alliance to please feel free to be in touch.
Yay. And that's the that's allianceforpeacebuilding.org, allianceforpeacebuilding.org. And if you would love to tap into a whole range of resources, ideas, definitely become a member. It's highly, highly encourage it. Very, very well-respected group. Melanie, I want to thank you again for just who you are, what you and the team are doing. Appreciation also to Chip House for his partnership a couple years ago, and just keep up the great work, and just let us know how we can ever be supportive of you.
Well, you are already, but thank you so much for that, Philip. It's just been a real honor to be here with you.
Yay, wonderful. And I want to thank everyone for listening. Today has been just an incredible day of learning looking at embodying peace from the inner to the international. And there is so much room for optimism to hear what all is just a glimpse of what's emerging around the world. So we, again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to you being with us for the next sessions this coming Saturday. And also encourage you to join us on facebook.com/Shift Network. So wherever you are in the world, whether it's morning, afternoon, evening, or night, have a peaceful rest of your time. All right. Bye-bye.